Human history is preserved in artifacts, objects that survived centuries or millennia to tell us about civilizations long gone, artistic achievements we can no longer replicate, and cultural treasures that connect us to our ancestors. Museums, archaeologists, and conservators dedicate their lives to protecting these irreplaceable objects. Then there were these people who proved that thousands of years of survival means nothing when someone decides to take a selfie, attempt amateur restoration, or simply not pay attention to where they're swinging a hammer. Buckle up for a devastating masterclass in how to destroy history that can never be replaced. 1. In 2012, an elderly Spanish woman named Cecilia Jimenez decided to restore a 19th century fresco of Jesus Christ called Ecce Homo in her local church in Borja, Spain. The fresco had been damaged by moisture over time, and Jimenez, with no art training whatsoever, took it upon herself to fix it without asking permission or consulting professionals. Using craft store paints, she completely painted over the original artwork, transforming the solemn portrait of Christ crowned with thorns into what the internet immediately dubbed Monkey Jesus, a blob-like face with crude features that bore no resemblance to the original. The botched restoration became international news and a viral sensation, with people traveling from around the world to see the disaster. The original fresco, while not particularly valuable artistically, was now completely and irreversibly destroyed beneath layers of amateur paint. Jimenez claimed she was trying to help and had even asked the local priest permission to restore it, though neither she nor the priest understood that restoration requires trained conservators with specialized knowledge. The incident became the most famous example of disastrous amateur restoration, and the church eventually embraced the attention, charging admission to see Monkey Jesus and generating significant tourism revenue from Jimenez's catastrophic mistake. 2. In 2006, a visitor to the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, tripped on his shoelace and fell down a staircase, knocking over 3 17th-century Chinese Qing dynasty vases that had stood on a windowsill for over 4 decades without incident. The vases, dating from around 1700 and valued at approximately $175,000, shattered into hundreds of pieces. Museum staff collected every fragment and spent months painstakingly gluing the vases back together, but restoration could only approximate the original's appearance and could never restore their historical integrity. The visitor, Nick Flynn, described the moment as happening in slow motion as he tumbled down the stairs and watched helplessly as he knocked over each vase sequentially. The museum had positioned the vases on a windowsill without protective barriers or cases, and Flynn's shoelace had simply come untied at the worst possible moment. The incident led museums worldwide to reconsider how they display fragile artifacts, but the damage to the 3 vases was permanent despite skilled restoration efforts. 3. In 2001, the Taliban deliberately destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan, 2 massive 6th century statues carved into a cliff face that had survived for over 1,500 years. The statues stood 175 feet and 120 feet tall and were considered masterpieces of Buddhist art and cultural heritage. Taliban leader Mullah Mohammed Omar declared the statues idolatrous and ordered their destruction despite international pleas for preservation. Taliban forces spent weeks drilling holes, planting explosives, and detonating charges before the ancient statues finally collapsed into rubble. The destruction shocked the world and became a symbol of cultural heritage destroyed by religious extremism and intolerance. International museums and countries had offered to dismantle and relocate the statues, or even to pay Afghanistan not to destroy them, but the Taliban proceeded anyway. The statues had survived conquests, wars, and natural disasters for over a millennium, only to be deliberately obliterated in March 2001. UNESCO declared the destruction a crime against culture, but the Bamiyan Buddhas were gone forever, with only photographs and measurements remaining to document what had been one of the most significant examples of ancient Buddhist art. 4. In 2015, a 12-year-old boy tripped and fell against a glass case at a museum in Taiwan, putting his hands through the glass to break his fall and accidentally punching a hole through a 350-year-old painting titled Flowers by Italian artist Paolo Porpora. The painting, valued at approximately $1.5 million, depicted a vase of flowers and was on loan from a private collector for exhibition. The boy's fist went directly through the canvas, leaving a hole roughly the size of a fist in the center of the 17th century artwork. Museum security footage captured the entire incident, showing the boy stumbling and instinctively reaching out to catch himself, with his hand going through both the glass and the canvas. The painting was restored by conservators, but restoration could not replace the original paint and canvas destroyed by the accident. The museum's insurance covered the damage, and the family was not held liable because the boy had been supervised, and the incident was clearly accidental. However, the incident raised questions about why such a valuable painting was displayed in a case with glass that could be easily broken, and why the case wasn't positioned away from walking paths where stumbling visitors might collide with it. 5. In 1858, workers cleaning the Great Pyramid of Giza's interior chambers used pickaxes to remove what they thought was accumulated debris, accidentally destroying ancient hieroglyphics and carvings that had survived for over 4,000 years. The workers were employed by European explorers who wanted to clear the chambers for study, but had given the workers insufficient training about what was historically significant and what was actually debris. Countless hieroglyphics that might have provided information about the pyramid's construction and purpose were chipped away and discarded before anyone realized what was being destroyed. By the time Egyptologists examined what remained, significant portions of the pyramid's interior inscriptions had been permanently lost. The damage was compounded by earlier visitors who had carved their own names and graffiti over ancient carvings, and by treasure hunters who had chipped away at walls, searching for hidden chambers. 19th century archaeology was more about collecting artifacts for museums than preservation, and the loss of information from the Great Pyramid's interior represents one of the most significant losses of ancient Egyptian historical evidence, all because workers with pickaxes didn't understand what they were destroying. 6. In 2013, archaeologists discovered a 300-year-old shipwreck off the coast of Colombia containing billions of dollars worth of gold, silver, and emeralds. Before proper archaeological excavation could be organized, treasure hunters and salvage companies began legal battles over rights to the wreck. And during one expedition, modern salvage equipment accidentally destroyed significant portions of the ship's hull and scattered artifacts across the ocean floor. The shipwreck, believed to be the Spanish galleon San Jose that sank in 1708, represented an incredible archaeological find that could have provided information about 18th century Spanish trade and shipbuilding. Instead, competing interests focused on the treasure's monetary value rather than its historical importance, and aggressive salvage attempts destroyed context and artifacts that could never be recovered. Maritime archaeologists watching from shore couldn't intervene as the archaeological site was compromised by salvage operations more interested in gold than history. The wreck's exact location remains classified to prevent further damage, but the destruction already caused means historians lost irreplaceable information about colonial-era maritime trade and culture. 7. In 1966, during China's Cultural Revolution, Red Guards destroyed countless historical artifacts, temples, and cultural sites in an effort to eliminate old culture, old customs, old habits, and old ideas. Ancient temples that had stood for over 1,000 years were demolished. Priceless artifacts were smashed, historical texts were burned, and anything associated with China's pre-communist past was targeted for destruction. Millions of artifacts were destroyed during the decade-long campaign, including irreplaceable Buddhist sculptures, Confucian texts, ancient musical instruments, and architectural treasures. The destruction was systematic and ideologically driven, with young Red Guards specifically trained to identify and destroy historical items. UNESCO estimates that the Cultural Revolution destroyed more Chinese historical artifacts than all previous wars and natural disasters combined. Many items that survived were only preserved because individuals risked their lives hiding artifacts from the Red Guards, burying valuable items or disguising them as worthless junk. The scale of cultural destruction during this period represents one of history's greatest losses of heritage, with entire categories of Chinese art and artifacts now known only through photographs and written descriptions of items that no longer exist. 8. In 2001, a worker installing a new toilet in the Royal Ontario Museum accidentally knocked over and shattered a 2,400-year-old Greek amphora that had been removed from display for the renovation but left sitting unsecured in the work area. The amphora, a large ceramic vessel decorated with scenes from Greek mythology, was valued at over $500,000 and had survived intact for over 2 millennia. The worker hadn't been told the item was a priceless artifact, assuming everything valuable had been moved to secure storage before construction began. The amphora fell approximately 3 feet and shattered into dozens of pieces. Museum conservators spent months attempting restoration, gluing fragments back together, but several pieces were pulverized on impact and couldn't be recovered. The restored amphora shows visible crack lines throughout and has lost much of its historical integrity. The museum accepted responsibility for leaving the artifact in an active construction zone, but the damage was irreversible. 9. In 2018, a Brazilian National Museum fire destroyed approximately 20 million artifacts, including the oldest human remains ever found in the Americas, irreplaceable indigenous artifacts, and extensive natural history collections accumulated over 200 years. The fire began after the museum closed for the day and spread rapidly through the wooden building that hadn't been properly maintained due to budget cuts. Firefighters arrived but discovered nearby fire hydrants weren't working, forcing them to pump water from a nearby lake. By the time adequate water pressure was achieved, most of the museum's contents had been destroyed. The 11,500-year-old skull, known as Lutzia, representing the earliest known human in the Americas, was lost in the fire. Countless indigenous artifacts that represented the only physical evidence of extinct cultures were burned. Meteorites, fossils, and historical documents that had survived for centuries or millennia were destroyed in hours. Investigation revealed the fire was caused by an electrical fault in an aging air conditioning system, and the catastrophic loss was entirely preventable with proper building maintenance and safety systems. The destroyed museum represented Brazil's natural and human history, with many artifacts being literally irreplaceable, the only existing examples of their kind. 10. In 1938, a janitor at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University was cleaning near a Chinese bronze sculpture from the Shang dynasty, dating to approximately 1200 BCE when he accidentally knocked it off its pedestal. The sculpture, a ritual wine vessel called a gu, shattered on the marble floor. The 3,000-year-old bronze had survived wars, dynasties, and countless centuries only to be destroyed by a cleaning accident. The museum attempted restoration, but bronze doesn't glue back together the way pottery can, and the vessel was permanently compromised. The incident occurred because the sculpture hadn't been properly secured to its pedestal, and the janitor had been working alone at night without supervision. Museums subsequently revised protocols for cleaning near valuable artifacts and required that extremely valuable items be secured to prevent similar accidents. 11. In 2003, during the Iraq War, the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad was looted and vandalized as American forces focused on military objectives, while Iraqi police abandoned their posts. Looters took or destroyed approximately 15,000 artifacts, spanning 5,000 years of Mesopotamian history. Ancient Sumerian tablets, Assyrian sculptures, and Babylonian artifacts were stolen, smashed, or both. The Warka Vase, a 5,000-year-old Sumerian artifact considered one of the earliest examples of narrative relief sculpture, was stolen and later recovered damaged. The international archaeological community watched in horror as news broadcasts showed looters destroying glass cases and stealing artifacts, while American forces did nothing to secure the museum, despite advance warnings that cultural sites required protection. Some items were eventually recovered through international efforts, but thousands of artifacts were lost forever or remain in private collections. The looting represented an irreplaceable loss of historical evidence about the earliest civilizations, and the failure to protect the museum despite explicit warnings remains controversial. 12. In 1972, a worker at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence accidentally dropped and broke an ancient Roman marble sculpture while moving it to a new display location. The sculpture, a 2,000-year-old Roman copy of a Greek original, fell from a cart and shattered on the marble floor. Museum staff spent months attempting restoration, but marble sculpture is particularly difficult to restore invisibly, and the repaired piece shows clear evidence of damage. The incident occurred because proper equipment for moving heavy sculptures wasn't available, and the worker attempted to move the piece using inadequate materials. Museums worldwide subsequently implemented strict protocols for artifact transportation, requiring specialized equipment and multiple trained personnel. 13. In 1814, British soldiers burned the White House and the Library of Congress during the War of 1812, destroying countless historical documents, including correspondence from the Continental Congress and irreplaceable early American books and manuscripts. The Library of Congress collection, which included books dating back to the 1500s and unique manuscripts documenting American colonial history, was completely lost. Soldiers piled furniture and books in the center of rooms and set them ablaze. The fire also destroyed original White House furnishings and artwork, including a portrait of George Washington that Dolly Madison famously saved by having it cut from its frame. Thomas Jefferson later sold his personal library to Congress to replace some of what was lost, but many documents and books were unique items that could never be replaced. The deliberate destruction of cultural institutions during warfare represented a loss not just to America, but to historical scholarship, as many of the destroyed items were the only surviving copies of their kind. 14. In 2020, a museum volunteer in Germany accidentally started a dishwasher cycle with an ancient Egyptian bowl inside, partially destroying the 3,000-year-old artifact. The volunteer had been cleaning storage areas and apparently mistook the bowl, which had been set on a counter temporarily, for a dirty dish. The bowl was made of fired clay and had hieroglyphic inscriptions. The dishwasher's hot water, detergent, and agitation damaged the surface, eroded some of the hieroglyphics, and weakened the structure. Museum officials discovered the error when they couldn't find the bowl in storage and eventually found it in the dishwasher. The volunteer was apparently unaware of the bowl's significance and age. The incident highlighted the danger of allowing untrained personnel access to storage areas containing valuable artifacts without adequate supervision and labeling systems. 15. In 1966, thieves attempting to steal a 600-year-old statue of the Virgin Mary from a church in Italy accidentally dropped and destroyed it while trying to carry it to their getaway vehicle. The wooden medieval sculpture, which had stood in the church since the 14th century, fell down stone steps and shattered. The thieves fled without the statue, leaving it in pieces. Church officials attempted restoration, but the sculpture's original integrity was lost. The statue had survived 6 centuries, including wars, earthquakes, and previous theft attempts, only to be destroyed by modern thieves who fumbled it during their escape. The thieves were never caught, and the destroyed statue represents a permanent loss of medieval artistic heritage. 16. In 2017, construction workers in China accidentally demolished a 700-year-old Ming Dynasty city wall while building a new development. The construction company had received permits and maps, but apparently didn't check whether any historical structures existed on the property before beginning demolition. By the time archaeologists heard about the construction and arrived to intervene, a 30-meter section of the ancient wall had been bulldozed and carted away as rubble. Chinese officials were outraged, but the wall was gone. The construction company claimed they didn't realize the old wall was historically significant, assuming it was just old bricks that needed to be cleared for the new project. The demolished section of wall had survived Mongol invasions, the fall of the Ming Dynasty, the Chinese Civil War, and the Cultural Revolution, only to be bulldozed because a construction crew didn't check historical records before demolishing old bricks. 17. In 1755, the Great Lisbon earthquake, tsunami, and subsequent fires destroyed countless historical artifacts, libraries, and art collections. But the destruction was made worse by looters and by authorities who demolished damaged buildings without first removing valuable items inside. The earthquake occurred on All Saints' Day when many people were in church, and falling candles started fires that spread through the destroyed city. The royal palace, which housed priceless artwork, historical documents, and royal collections, was completely destroyed. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts and books burned. Artworks by Renaissance masters melted or were buried under rubble. In the chaos following the earthquake, authorities focused on preventing disease and removing rubble, demolishing damaged buildings before anyone could salvage the historical items inside. The disaster destroyed much of Portugal's cultural heritage, and while the earthquake itself was a natural disaster, the failure to prioritize artifact recovery before demolishing damaged structures represents a human failure that compounded the natural loss. 18. In 2004, a cleaning lady at a German museum threw away a contemporary art installation consisting of a rubber trough she thought was trash waiting to be removed. The artwork, created by artist Martin Kippenberger and valued at approximately $800,000, was titled "When It Starts Dripping from the Ceiling," and consisted of a trough positioned under a wooden slat structure designed to catch pretend rain. The cleaning lady saw what appeared to be a dirty rubber container and removed it as trash. By the time museum officials realized the artwork was missing, it had been thrown away with other garbage and was unrecoverable. While the artwork was modern rather than historical, the incident highlighted how subjective determinations about what constitutes art versus trash can result in valuable items being destroyed by well-meaning people who don't understand context. The museum couldn't hold the cleaning lady responsible because she was simply doing her job, removing what appeared to be trash, and the museum admitted the installation should have been better marked or protected. 19. In 1945, Allied bombing during World War II destroyed countless historical buildings, artworks, and cultural treasures throughout Europe, despite efforts to avoid cultural sites. The bombing of Dresden, Germany, for example, destroyed one of the most beautiful Baroque cities in Europe, along with priceless art collections and historical buildings. The bombing of Monte Cassino in Italy destroyed a 1,400-year-old monastery that had housed irreplaceable medieval manuscripts and artworks. While military necessity was argued as justification, many of the destroyed sites had limited military value and represented irreplaceable cultural heritage. The Allied forces did maintain monumentsmen units dedicated to protecting art and architecture, but their efforts were often overruled by military commanders prioritizing tactical objectives. The deliberate targeting of cities as a strategy to break civilian morale resulted in the destruction of countless historical artifacts that had survived centuries of previous wars. The rubble of Dresden alone contained the crushed remains of museums, libraries, churches, and palaces that held artifacts dating back centuries, all destroyed in a single night of bombing. 20. In 2014, ISIS militants destroyed ancient Assyrian artifacts in the Mosul Museum in Iraq, smashing 3,000-year-old sculptures with sledgehammers and posting video of the destruction online. The militants destroyed items because they considered them idolatrous, including priceless Assyrian winged bulls, ancient pottery, and statues that had survived millennia. They also used explosives to demolish ancient archaeological sites, including Nimrud, Hatra, and parts of Palmyra in Syria. UNESCO condemned the actions as war crimes and cultural genocide. The destroyed artifacts represented some of the only physical evidence of ancient Mesopotamian civilizations, and their loss was devastating to archaeological and historical knowledge. The militants deliberately targeted cultural heritage sites to attract international attention and demonstrate their power, prioritizing propaganda value over any concern for human history. Many of the destroyed items were unique and can never be replaced, though 3D reconstructions have been created using photographs of some pieces. 21. In 1953, a visitor to the Louvre accidentally spilled a bottle of ink on a 16th century tapestry, permanently staining the textile artwork that depicted scenes from classical mythology. Museum attendants rushed to blot the ink, but it had already soaked into the ancient fibers. Conservation efforts minimized but couldn't eliminate the staining. The visitor had been carrying the ink bottle in a bag that broke, spilling ink across the tapestry. Museums subsequently banned bringing liquids near textile displays, but the damage to the 400-year-old tapestry was permanent. The incident demonstrated that even accidental exposure to common substances like ink can destroy artifacts that proper environmental controls and visitor rules could have protected. 22. In 2007, workers renovating a historic building in Philadelphia discovered and threw away hundreds of letters and documents dating to Benjamin Franklin's era, assuming they were old trash rather than historical documents. The papers had been stored in walls during previous renovations and were uncovered when workers removed old plaster. Not recognizing their potential significance, Workers disposed of the documents along with other construction debris. By the time a historian heard about the renovation and asked about the possibility of historical documents, the trash had already been removed to a landfill. Despite efforts to search the landfill, the documents were never recovered. The loss represented a preventable tragedy where historic documents that survived for over 200 years were destroyed, because construction workers weren't trained to recognize potentially significant historical materials and didn't know to call historians before disposing of old papers found during renovation work. 23. In 1988, a fire at the Amsterdam City Museum destroyed important works by artists including Rembrandt and Vermeer. The fire began in a storage area and spread rapidly before firefighters could contain it. Many of the destroyed paintings were Dutch Golden Age masterpieces that could never be replaced. The fire was caused by faulty electrical wiring that hadn't been upgraded despite the building's age and the value of its contents. Investigation revealed that museum management had been warned about electrical problems, but delayed repairs due to budget constraints. The destroyed artwork represented not just financial loss, but cultural heritage loss, as these paintings were among the finest examples of 17th century Dutch art. The fire demonstrated that inadequate maintenance and safety systems in museums can result in catastrophic losses that budget savings cannot justify when weighed against the irreplaceable nature of the destroyed items. 24. In 2016, a man in Portugal looking for buried treasure used a backhoe to excavate a prehistoric dolmen, ancient stone monument, dating to approximately 4000 BCE, destroying the 6,000-year-old structure. The man had heard local legends about treasure buried under ancient stones and decided to dig without permission or archaeological oversight. By the time authorities discovered what he was doing, the dolmen had been largely destroyed, with massive stones displaced and the structure's integrity compromised. The man was arrested and charged with destroying a protected historical monument, but the damage was irreversible. The dolmen had stood for 6 millennia and was one of the region's most significant prehistoric monuments. Its destruction for the sake of treasure hunting that produced no treasure demonstrated how legends and greed can lead to the destruction of irreplaceable historical structures. 25. In 1985, an inexperienced art restorer in Spain attempted to clean a medieval fresco and accidentally removed much of the original paint along with the dirt, leaving only faint traces of the original artwork. The restorer had used modern chemical cleaners designed for contemporary paint that were far too aggressive for 14th century fresco technique. By the time the damage was discovered, much of the fresco's detail had been stripped away, leaving a ghost of the original image. The church sued the restorer, but the damage couldn't be reversed. The incident led to stricter regulations about who could perform restoration work on historical artworks and what techniques were permissible. The destroyed fresco had survived nearly 600 years, including periods of war, neglect, and environmental damage, only to be ruined by an unqualified restorer's use of inappropriate modern chemicals on ancient paint. 26. In 2013, workers replacing carpet at the Getty Villa Museum in Los Angeles temporarily moved Roman sculptures onto carts but failed to secure them properly. One sculpture, a 2,000-year-old marble figure, fell off the cart and broke into pieces when the cart was bumped during the moving process. The sculpture was eventually restored, but restoration always leaves evidence of the damage and compromises the artifact's historical integrity. The incident occurred because workers were rushing to complete the carpet replacement before the museum reopened and didn't take time to properly secure the valuable sculptures they were moving. Museum administration accepted responsibility for the inadequate supervision and training that led to the accident. 27. In 1944, a V-2 rocket strike on London destroyed a significant portion of the British Museum's collection when the bomb hit a storage facility where artifacts had been moved for safety during the war. The irony of artifacts being destroyed in storage they had been moved to for protection was not lost on museum officials. Ancient Greek sculptures, Egyptian artifacts, and medieval manuscripts were destroyed in the blast and subsequent fire. While the destruction was an act of war rather than negligence, the loss represented irreplaceable historical items that had survived for centuries only to be destroyed by modern warfare. The British Museum's decision to distribute collections to multiple locations rather than concentrating them in one facility probably prevented even greater losses, as artifacts stored elsewhere survived. 28. In 2008, a tourist in Italy broke off a finger from a 600-year-old statue while posing for a photo. The tourist had climbed over a barrier to get closer to the statue for a better photo angle, and accidentally knocked the marble finger off when he leaned against the sculpture. Museum guards immediately arrested the tourist, who claimed he hadn't realized the statue was fragile or that touching it was prohibited, despite multiple signs in several languages forbidding touching artifacts. The broken finger was recovered and reattached by museum conservators, but the sculpture was permanently damaged. The incident led museums in Italy to increase enforcement of no-touching rules and to position more barriers between visitors and valuable sculptures. 29. In 1966, flooding in Florence, Italy, damaged or destroyed hundreds of thousands of artworks, manuscripts, and historical documents when the Arno River overflowed its banks and flooded the city's museums, churches, and libraries. The Florence flood destroyed irreplaceable medieval manuscripts, damaged Renaissance paintings, and buried historical artifacts under mud and debris. The flood was a natural disaster, but the extent of damage was worsened by inadequate flood control systems and the storage of valuable items in basement locations, despite Florence's known flood risk. International volunteers and conservators rushed to Florence to save what they could, pioneering new restoration techniques in the process. Many items were saved, but countless artifacts were lost forever. The disaster led to improved flood control systems and revised storage protocols for valuable artifacts, but the destroyed items represented an irreplaceable loss of Renaissance and medieval cultural heritage. 30. In 2019, the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris caught fire during renovation work, destroying the cathedral's 13th century wooden roof structure, known as the Forest, because of the massive number of ancient oak beams, melting lead from the roof that had been in place for centuries, and damaging priceless stained glass windows and artworks. The fire began in the attic, apparently from an electrical fault or discarded cigarette related to renovation work. Firefighters fought for hours to save the cathedral, successfully preventing the complete collapse of the structure and saving many artifacts, including the Crown of Thorns relic. However, the destroyed roof represented medieval carpentry that could never be truly replicated, and damaged sections of the cathedral had survived 850 years only to be destroyed during a renovation intended to preserve them. Investigation revealed that adequate fire safety systems had not been installed during the renovation, and that warning signs of electrical problems had been ignored. The destroyed portions of Notre Dame represented not just religious heritage, but medieval architectural achievement and centuries of European history. 31. In 2001, a student on a school trip to a museum in Germany leaned against a glass display case containing ancient Egyptian artifacts and accidentally pushed it over. The case shattered, and several artifacts inside broke, including a 3,000-year-old ceramic vessel and several smaller items. The student was simply being careless rather than malicious, but the damage was devastating. Museum staff collected the fragments and attempted restoration, but several items were too damaged to fully repair. The incident led schools to revise their museum visit protocols and museums to ensure display cases were more stable. The destroyed artifacts had survived 3 millennia only to be broken by a moment of teenage carelessness. 32. In 1990, thieves stealing paintings from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston caused additional damage to artwork they didn't steal by cutting paintings from their frames in ways that damaged the canvases. The thieves stole 13 artworks, including paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Manet, but their rough handling during the theft caused additional damage to both stolen and remaining items. The stolen artwork has never been recovered and remains missing over 30 years later. The theft represents not just the loss of the stolen items, but additional damage caused by the thieves' rough methods, compounding the cultural loss. The empty frames still hang in the museum as reminders of the missing masterpieces. 33. In 2003, American soldiers in Iraq used the ancient city of Babylon as a military base, with helicopters landing on ancient brick streets, tanks driving over archaeological ruins, and soldiers filling sandbags with ancient artifact-bearing soil. The occupation of the ancient site caused more damage to the 4,000-year-old ruins than centuries of exposure to weather and time. UNESCO condemned the use of World Heritage Sites for military purposes, but significant damage had already occurred by the time the military vacated the site. Archaeologists examining the site after military departure found that ancient bricks had been crushed by vehicles, archaeological layers had been disturbed by construction of military fortifications, and artifacts had been destroyed or carried away as souvenirs. The military's choice to occupy an ancient site demonstrated a failure to recognize or prioritize cultural heritage protection during wartime operations. 34. In 2017, a California couple found rare gold coins buried on their property and sold them publicly. But during the excavation process, they destroyed significant archaeological context that could have provided information about when, how, and why the coins were buried. The coins dated to the 1800s and were worth millions of dollars. But archaeologists noted that the couple's amateur excavation destroyed any possibility of understanding the historical context surrounding the coins' burial. The couple used shovels and pickaxes to dig up the coins, destroying stratification and disturbing the burial site in ways that made it impossible to determine whether the coins represented a hidden treasure, a robbery stash, or something else entirely. The financial value was preserved, but the historical value was destroyed through careless excavation that prioritized recovery over documentation. 35. In 1992, a janitor at a museum in Russia accidentally unplugged a climate control system in a storage room to plug in his vacuum cleaner and forgot to plug the climate control system back in. The storage room housed ancient textiles that required specific temperature and humidity levels. Over the weekend, without climate control, the textiles were exposed to fluctuating conditions that caused irreversible damage. Some textiles degraded significantly, and others became moldy. By Monday, when museum staff discovered the problem, thousands of years of preservation had been undone by 3 days of improper climate conditions. The damaged textiles included ancient Egyptian linens and medieval tapestries that had survived for centuries with proper care. The incident led to improved protocols preventing climate control systems from being unplugged and requiring monitoring systems to alert staff immediately if climate conditions change unexpectedly. 36. In 2012, workers demolishing an old building in China discovered ancient Buddhist sculptures in the walls, but continued demolition anyway, crushing the sculptures under falling debris. By the time anyone notified archaeologists about the discovery, the sculptures had been destroyed. The workers apparently didn't realize the significance of the carved stones, thinking they were just decorative elements from a more recent renovation. The destroyed sculptures dated to the Tang dynasty, approximately 1,200 years old, and represented important examples of Buddhist art. The demolition company was fined, but the sculptures were lost forever. The incident highlighted the need for archaeological surveys before demolishing historic buildings, and better training for construction workers about recognizing potentially significant historical items. 37. In 2005, a chemistry professor at a university museum borrowed an ancient Peruvian ceramic vessel to use as a prop in a presentation about historical pottery techniques. During the presentation, he dropped the vessel, shattering the 1,500-year-old artifact in front of his class. The professor had been given permission to use the artifact for educational purposes, but had handled it carelessly, gesturing dramatically while holding the vessel and losing his grip. Museum officials were horrified, and the professor was banned from borrowing artifacts in the future. The vessel was from the Moche culture and was one of relatively few intact examples in the museum's collection. Conservators attempted to glue the pieces back together, but the restored vessel showed obvious damage. The incident led universities to establish stricter protocols about faculty borrowing museum artifacts for teaching purposes. 38. In 1950, during the Korean War, both North Korean and South Korean forces used ancient temples and palaces as military headquarters, resulting in the destruction of numerous historical buildings when they were targeted by opposing forces. The Gyeongbokgung Palace, which dated to 1395, suffered additional damage during the war after having already been damaged during Japanese occupation. Countless cultural artifacts housed in these buildings were destroyed when the buildings were bombed or burned. The decision by military forces on both sides to occupy cultural heritage sites made those sites military targets and ensured their destruction. After the war, some buildings were reconstructed, but original historical integrity was lost, and artifacts destroyed in the fighting could never be replaced. The war's cultural damage represented a loss of Korean heritage that neither side intended, but both sides facilitated through the choice to use historical sites for military purposes. 39. In 2018, Brazilian street artist Eduardo Cobra attempted to create a mural honoring indigenous culture, but accidentally painted over a section of wall containing petroglyphs, ancient rock carvings, that dated back approximately 3,000 years. Cobra and his team apparently didn't realize the rock surface contained historical carvings that had been documented by archaeologists decades earlier. The modern paint covered and damaged the ancient petroglyphs, which couldn't be fully removed without destroying what was underneath. Archaeologists were devastated, noting that Cobra had essentially vandalized a 3,000-year-old artwork to create his own modern artwork. Cobra apologized and claimed ignorance about the petroglyphs, but the damage was done. The incident demonstrated the importance of archaeological surveys before authorizing public art projects on rock surfaces that might contain historical markings. 40. In 1991, a museum security guard in Moscow was drinking vodka during his shift and became intoxicated. He stumbled into a display case containing Scythian gold artifacts dating to approximately 400 BCE, knocking over the case and scattering the contents across the floor. Several delicate gold ornaments were crushed when the guard fell on them, trying to catch his balance. The guard was immediately fired and faced criminal charges, but the damaged artifacts represented irreplaceable examples of ancient Scythian metalwork. Museum officials attempted restoration on the crushed gold items, but their original forms were lost. The incident led to stricter policies about security guard conduct and monitoring, as well as more robust display cases that couldn't be easily knocked over. 41. In 2015, a Hollywood film crew shooting an action movie in a historically significant location in Turkey accidentally damaged 2,000-year-old Roman ruins when a stunt involving explosions went wrong. The production company had received permits to film at the location, but had apparently not disclosed the full extent of planned explosives to authorities. The explosion was larger than permitted and caused part of an ancient stone archway to collapse. Turkish officials were furious and the production company was fined, but the damaged Roman structure couldn't be fully restored to its original condition. The incident highlighted the tension between using historic locations for film production to generate revenue and tourism interest versus protecting those sites from damage caused by modern film production techniques. 42. In 1986, conservation workers cleaning the exterior of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., used cleaning chemicals that were too strong, inadvertently removing the stone's protective patina and exposing fresh marble that would weather more quickly in the future. The overly aggressive cleaning was intended to remove pollution staining, but resulted in damage to the memorial's surface that reduced its ability to resist future weathering. The mistake wasn't discovered until after the entire memorial had been cleaned, and the damage was irreversible. Conservation science has since advanced to prevent similar mistakes, but the Lincoln Memorial will weather more quickly because of the 1986 cleaning error. The incident demonstrated that even well-intentioned conservation efforts can damage the artifacts they're meant to protect when improper techniques or materials are used. 43. In 2004, a flood at the National Library in Prague damaged hundreds of thousands of historical books and manuscripts when the Vltava River overflowed during record flooding. The library housed irreplaceable medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and historical documents. Despite advance warning of the flood, evacuation of the library's contents wasn't completed in time, and water reached the ground floor where many items were stored. Volunteers and conservators worked for months to dry and restore water-damaged materials, employing freeze-drying and other specialized techniques. Many items were saved, but some were lost forever. The disaster led to improved flood preparedness and the relocation of the most valuable items to higher floors, but the loss represented manuscripts and books that had survived for centuries, only to be destroyed by water in the 21st century. 44. In 1997, a lightning strike caused a fire at the Royal Palace of Turin in Italy, destroying portions of the historic structure and damaging artwork and historical furnishings inside. The palace, which dated to the 16th century, had survived wars and political upheaval but wasn't adequately protected against lightning strikes. Firefighters prevented the fire from completely destroying the palace, but significant portions of the interior were lost, including tapestries, paintings, and historic furnishings that had been in the palace for centuries. Investigation revealed that modern lightning protection systems hadn't been installed, despite recommendations from safety inspectors. The fire represented a preventable loss of cultural heritage that could have been avoided with proper modern protective systems that don't compromise historical structures' appearance while protecting them from natural hazards. 45. And finally, in 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown, museums worldwide discovered mold, pest infestations, and environmental damage in collections that occurred because reduced staffing meant climate control systems weren't monitored as carefully and regular collection checks weren't performed. Multiple museums reported significant damage to artifacts that occurred during the months when facilities were closed or operating with skeleton crews. Textiles became moldy, paper materials were damaged by insects, and environmental fluctuations caused warping and cracking in wooden objects. The pandemic demonstrated that artifact preservation requires constant vigilance and that even temporary neglect can cause irreversible damage to items that survived for centuries with proper care. Museums scrambled to assess and address damage once full operations resumed, but items that degraded during the shutdown suffered permanent losses. The distributed nature of this destruction made it less visible than a single dramatic incident, but the cumulative loss across hundreds of museums worldwide represented a significant blow to cultural heritage preservation, all because the human systems that normally protect artifacts were disrupted by a pandemic emergency that no one had adequately planned for. Here's the brutal truth about destroying historical artifacts. Most destruction isn't caused by villains deliberately targeting cultural heritage, but by ordinary people making careless mistakes, ignorant decisions, or prioritizing short-term convenience over long-term preservation. These artifacts survived for centuries or millennia through wars, natural disasters, and societal upheaval, only to be destroyed in seconds by someone who didn't pay attention, didn't understand what they were handling, or simply didn't care enough to be careful. The real artifact was the irreplaceable history we destroyed along the way. Every broken sculpture, burned manuscript, and demolished ruin represents information about human civilization that we could never recover, connections to our past that are permanently severed, and artistic achievements that we can admire only in photographs rather than experiencing firsthand. History's lesson is clear: protecting cultural heritage requires constant vigilance, adequate resources, proper training, and a commitment to prioritizing preservation over convenience. The most advanced restoration techniques cannot truly replace what's been destroyed, and every generation has a responsibility to pass on to the next generation the artifacts that were entrusted to us by all the generations before. Subscribe if you want to learn from these preventable disasters, and remember that when you're near historical artifacts, whether in museums, historic sites, or anywhere else, a moment of carelessness can destroy something that survived for centuries, and no apology can bring back what's been irreversibly lost.